Stop me if you've heard this one before. The Blue Jays are being linked to another high-profile outfielder with serious red flags, Luis Robert Jr. from the Chicago White Sox. And once again, everyone is getting excited about the name, the potential, the tools, while completely ignoring the massive warning signs that are flashing like a highway construction zone. But this time it's different, right? This time the gamble will pay off. This time the injury-prone player with inconsistent production will suddenly become an all-star again just because he changed uniforms, except it won't. It never does. And if the Blue Jays actually pull the trigger on this trade, they'll be making one of the dumbest decisions of their entire offseason. Let me explain why. Luis Robert Jr. has posted an OPS of 657 in 2024 and 661 in 2025. Those aren't all-star numbers. Those aren't even above-average numbers. That's replacement-level production. In 291 plate appearances, Robert owns a 63 OPS plus and 185 batting average. 185. Do you understand how bad that is? That's historically terrible. That's the kind of production you'd expect from a utility infielder who plays once a week, not from a supposed star outfielder making $15 million. And yet here come the Blue Jays, ready to trade away top prospects for a player who can't stay healthy and can't hit when he is healthy. This is organizational insanity. But wait, the optimists will say. He was an all-star in 2023. He hit 38 home runs that year. He stole 20 bases. He had an 857 OPS. He was dominant. And you're right, for one season. One single season out of 6 in the major leagues. That's not a track record. That's an outlier. That's a fluke wrapped in good health for 145 games. Robert played in a career-high 145 games in 2023 after posting an 857 OPS. You know what happened before that season? Injuries. You know what happened after? More injuries and terrible performance. The pattern is clear. Luis Robert Jr. is not a reliable building block. He's a ticking time bomb who will drain your resources and give you nothing in return. The White Sox are asking for 2 top prospects in exchange for Robert. 2 top prospects for a player who hit 185 with a 63 OPS plus, for a player who's already 27 years old and showing zero signs of returning to his 2023 form, for a player whose defensive metrics have declined, for a player who can't stay on the field. The White Sox know exactly what they're doing. They're trying to dump Robert's contract and get something valuable in return before everyone realizes he's completely cooked. And the Blue Jays, being the Blue Jays, are probably going to fall for it. They're going to convince themselves that a change of scenery will fix everything, that their hitting coaches can unlock something the White Sox couldn't, that Robert just needs a fresh start. And it's all going to blow up in their faces spectacularly. Let's talk about the contract because this matters. Robert holds a base salary of $15 million as part of a 6-year deal worth $50 million, which includes club options in 2026 and 2027 that will rise to $20 million a season. So you're not just trading prospects for him. You're taking on $15 million this year and potentially $40 million more over the next 2 years. $40 million for a player who might not even be worth $5 million based on his current production. The White Sox exercised their $20 million option on Robert for 2026, which tells you they want to trade him at peak contract value before his price drops even further. They're locking in the money and shopping him aggressively. That should tell you everything you need to know about how Chicago views his future. The big question that surrounds Robert is health, as he only played 100 games last year and struggled to stay on the field. 100 games. Out of 162, that's his ceiling at this point. And most of those games, he was terrible. He wasn't producing when he was actually playing. So you're getting less than 2/3 of a season from a guy who's performing below replacement level. How is that an asset? How is that worth 2 top prospects? The answer is it's not. It never was. But the Blue Jays are going to talk themselves into it because that's what they do. They see 38 home runs from 2 years ago and ignore 185 batting average from this year. They see All-Star and ignore the injury history. They see the tools and ignore the results. At least a half dozen teams, including the Yankees, Mets, Dodgers, Phillies, Blue Jays, and Rangers, were interested in Robert during the trade deadline. But you know what happened? Nobody traded for him. None of those contending teams with smart front offices pulled the trigger. The Dodgers passed, the Yankees passed, the Phillies passed. Every single team that actually knows how to build a winner looked at Luis Robert Jr. and said, no thanks. But the Blue Jays are still interested. The Blue Jays are still making calls. The Blue Jays are still considering giving up premium assets for damaged goods. That tells you everything about the competence gap between Toronto and the rest of the league. Here's what really gets me about this entire situation. A proposed trade would send 4 prospects ranked in the Blue Jays' top 13, including 3 top 10 prospects. 4 prospects, including Jake Bloss, who they just acquired in the Yusei Kikuchi trade, including prospects they've been developing for years, all for Luis Robert Jr., a player who will be 28 next season, a player who can't stay healthy, a player who's hitting 185. Think about that math. You're giving up 4 potential major leaguers, 4 chances to hit on young talent for 1 declining veteran with a massive injury history. That's not smart roster construction. That's desperation masquerading as aggressiveness. White Sox general manager Chris Getz said there's a real possibility Robert remains with Chicago, noting that when you watch him play, you are looking at a guy who can change the game pretty quickly and in a lot of different ways. Translation, we can't get the return we want, so we're going to hold on to him and hope his value rebounds. The White Sox aren't getting offers they like because everyone else in baseball sees what's obvious. Luis Robert Jr. is not worth premium assets anymore. His value is cratered. His production has fallen off a cliff. And Chicago is desperately trying to spin it as them believing in him, when really they're just stuck with a bad contract and declining production. Let me paint you a picture of what's going to happen if the Blue Jays make this trade. Year 1, Robert plays 80 games. He hits .230 with 15 home runs. The advanced metrics show he's declining defensively. The Blue Jays miss the playoffs. Year 2, Robert gets injured in May. He comes back in August, but he's clearly not right. He finishes with a sub-700 OPS. The prospects they traded away are flourishing with other organizations. Year 3, the Blue Jays decline his $20 million option. They eat whatever buyout is attached. They move on. And we all sit here wondering how they didn't see this coming when every single warning sign was there from the beginning. That's the Luis Robert Jr. experience. That's what the Blue Jays are walking into with eyes wide open. Robert is due $15 million in 2025, followed by $20 million club options in both 2026 and 2027. The White Sox picked up the first option already, locking in his 2026 salary. They did that specifically to make him more tradable, to show teams he's under contract for multiple years. But all it really shows is that Chicago is confident enough someone will take on that money, and that someone is probably going to be the Blue Jays. Because Toronto always falls for this. They always think they're smarter than the market. They always believe they can fix what other teams couldn't, and they always end up wrong. Here's the most frustrating part. The Blue Jays don't even need Luis Robert Jr. They have outfield options. They have young players who could use playing time. They have bigger needs elsewhere on the roster. But Robert has a name. He's been an all-star. He creates buzz. And that's all the Blue Jays care about anymore. They don't care if it makes sense. They don't care if the risk outweighs the reward. They care about making a splash. They care about generating headlines. They care about showing the fan base they're doing something. And Luis Robert Jr. checks all those boxes, even though he doesn't check any of the boxes that actually matter, like staying healthy, like producing consistently, like being worth the assets you'd have to give up to get him. Getz said the White Sox have never been out there making phone calls about Robert. Rather, teams are calling them, and they stick to the plan in which if they feel they can help the long-term health of the organization, they'll make a move. Read between the lines. The White Sox aren't shopping him aggressively because they know his value is shot. They're waiting for some desperate team to talk themselves into him. They're playing hard to get while secretly hoping someone overpays. And the Blue Jays are exactly the kind of team that would do that. They're the team with a history of overpaying for declining players. They're the team that values name recognition over actual production. They're the perfect mark for what Chicago is trying to do here. Let's also address the elephant in the room. Robert has struggled offensively for most of the past 2 seasons, but looked like his 2023 All-Star self of late. hitting 6 home runs with 19 RBIs and an 853 OPS over his past 29 games before the deadline. So he had one good month, after 2 years of terrible production. And that's supposed to convince teams he's figured it out. That's supposed to justify giving up multiple top prospects. A hot streak doesn't erase the broader trend. It doesn't change the injury concerns. It doesn't address the fact that his overall numbers are still replacement level. But watch. The Blue Jays will point to that 29-game stretch as evidence he's turning it around. They'll use it to justify the trade. They'll convince themselves they're getting the all-star version. And then reality will hit when he reverts to the player he's been for the past 2 years. You want to know why the Dodgers didn't trade for Robert? Why the Yankees passed? Why the Phillies looked elsewhere? Because those organizations have standards. They have discipline. They don't chase names. They don't make emotional decisions. They evaluate players objectively, and they walk away when the price doesn't match the value. The Blue Jays don't operate that way. They get FOMO. They panic. They convince themselves they need to do something, even when doing nothing would be smarter. And that's why they're going to end up with Luis Robert Jr. on their roster, eating up salary and prospects while providing minimal return. Here's my prediction. The Blue Jays are going to make this trade. They're going to give up at least 2 of their top 10 prospects. They're going to take on Robert's contract. They're going to convince themselves and the fan base that they just upgraded their outfield. And within 6 months, everyone is going to realize it was a disaster. Robert will either get injured, perform poorly, or both. The prospects they traded will start producing elsewhere. The contract will become an albatross. And we'll all be sitting here talking about how obvious this was, how all the warning signs were there, how the Blue Jays should have known better, but they didn't know better. They never do. And that's why they'll forever be the team that makes moves that look good on paper but fall apart in reality. Luis Robert Jr. is just the latest example of that pattern, and the tragedy is that it's completely preventable. They just have to be smart enough to say no. But being smart has never been the Blue Jays' strength, and that's why this disaster is probably going to happen